All right, I think we are going live. Let's just see if that's the case. Yes, and we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Facebook Live with Prof. Noakes. My name is Yana Retief, and I will be your host for today. Prof and I are very excited to have you all here with us. If it's the first time that you are joining, you are welcome to pop any questions, any comments for Prof in the comment section. And if you are an old-timer joining us many times over again, please just say hi in the comments. Let us know where you're dialing in from. It's always lovely to hear from all of you. So just so that everyone knows, I've had a bit of a technical glitch. I couldn't get all the announcements up in time, but I'm going to ask our media team just to pop them in the comment section. So there's some exciting news from the Nutrition Network and from Eat Better South Africa. So make sure not to miss them. And we will also update the announcement box of this live after the session. So, Prof, how are you today?
Very well, thank you. Everything seems to be going well. Thank you very much. I hope everyone else is feeling the same.
That is great, Prof. So like I mentioned, actually, before we started the live, Prof and I had a quick chat, and we have quite a few questions to get through today. Many of you have sent in some questions in advance, and you're welcome to do that also for the future Facebook Lives. You can just send it either via our Facebook Messenger or to our email address, info@thenoakesfoundation.org. So without any further ado, let's dive in. So, Prof, the first question of the day is from Petra. Prof, I am not a professional athlete, but are weight training 3 times a week. I would like to lose some body fat and gain muscle. I'm already on an LCHF diet. What can I do to achieve this? Most people are telling me I need to carbo load to gain weight and then cut and do calorie deficit to see my muscle. Is this really the way to go?
No, I don't think so. The way to lose weight, if you are already on a low carb diet and you feel you want to get more definition, is, I think, to increase your protein intake and slightly reduce your fat intake. So move towards a higher protein intake, but don't suddenly increase the carbs. That's a disaster. I mean, you can try it, and I can tell you what will happen. You'll simply put on more fat, and that's what you don't want, particularly fat in the abdomen. The only way you can get rid of abdominal fat is by eating a low-carb diet. That's absolutely clear. So you can look thin. People can be thin but have visceral fat, and that visceral fat can only be removed on a low carbohydrate diet. So as soon as you put up the carbs, you push up your insulin and you drive the fat into the fat cells. So the problem is it's actually very difficult to eat a high protein diet. It's difficult to find the foods that are higher in protein and lower in fat. And also it's a problem because we've been promoting a higher fat diet to get rid of the carbs, eat more fat. And that's fine for most people. But if you want to become as muscular as possible, that may not be the best. You may need to increase your protein intake. That means more fish and more chicken, and ironically, more low-fat cheeses, because they have more protein and less fat than the high-fat forms of dairy. So dairy and nuts are probably the 2 things that you don't want to eat as much of, and replace that with lean meats and chicken and fish. The Ted Naiman is the sort of leading person who's been promoting this for a long time. And he talks about the P to E ratio, which is the foods that make you not hungry. That's the P component. I can't remember exactly what the P stands for.
I think it's protein to energy.
That's the one.
Yes.
It's a protein to energy ratio. And so he likes foods that are high in protein and low in energy. And those are the foods that he suggests you should be eating. It is difficult. It's much more difficult than just following a low-carb diet where you can eat lots of fat and not worry about it. But in this case, it does seem that some people are not fully satiated unless they eat more protein. So that's what I suggest. Read about the PE ratio and look for foods which have a higher protein and lower energy content.
Thank you, Prof. I think you already kind of answered the next question, which is also tying into protein, but it's from Andrew. And they're asking, how do you maintain muscle mass on a keto diet when only on 20% protein when you are super active doing endurance running and CrossFit?
Yeah, the way is if you find you aren't maintaining your muscle mass, then you just need to increase the protein exactly as we've described and reduce the fat in the diet and replace it with protein. And one of the leanest women I've seen in CrossFit eats a 60% protein diet. Now that's extreme. Now we used to say that that's impossible and it'd kill your kidneys. We know that's not the case, but that's a very restrictive, difficult diet to follow. But if you are really keen on it, that's what you need to do. Just as an aside, until the Olympic Games in about 1984 or 86, around about there, the athletes preferred protein. So that what someone did was they went and looked at what foods were provided to the Olympic athletes at the eating restaurants. And what did the athletes ask for? And they all asked for high protein. And it only changed after the 70s and the 80s when we got this wrong impression that carbohydrates were necessary. And then all of a sudden, athletes started eating lots of carbohydrates. And I think that's a problem. So just as an aside, I watched on television the South African cross country championships on television the other day, and I noticed that the children are looking fat. I mean, these are the best, fittest children in the schools in terms of running, and they're all carrying extra weight. And then, of course, you look at the finishers in many races in South Africa and across the globe, and you'll see they're all carrying 5 to 10 kilos of weight that they don't need. And why is it? Because they're being told to eat high carbs. And I think what people need to understand is that humans are not designed to eat lots of carbs because that requires you regulate your blood glucose all the time. And ultimately, diabetes is a failure of blood glucose regulation. That's a message that needs to get out. And the best way you don't threaten your blood glucose regulation is by not eating carbs. So what happens, what I've caused people to do by promoting this high carb diet is that they think it's good, so they eat lots of carbs and they become pre-diabetic, and then they present with a metabolic syndrome, which you see in these runners, finishing after 4 or 5 hours in the marathon. Many of them have clearly got the metabolic syndrome. And there's a paper out quite recently showing that the health of marathon runners, their metabolic markers are not good. They're not much better than the rest of the population. So the insulin resistance is not just specific to the people who are sitting on the couch watching everyone else exercise. They're also, unfortunately, present in the athletes who are erroneously thinking they must eat a high carbohydrate diet. So I think, Andrew, the best way for you forward is to, because you know exactly what's the protein content of your diet, push it up to 20, 30%. If you find that you're putting on muscle, push it up to 35 or 40% and just see what happens. But again, I indicate that's a difficult diet to follow, and you have to be an expert to choose the right foods. It's not everyone's going to get it right.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Andrew, for that question. Before we continue to the next question, I just want to say hi to a few people in the comment section. So Glauce Brooks, hello, all the way from Brazil. Always nice to see a familiar face. Janice also joining us again all the way from Illinois, USA. Price is from Melbourne, Australia. Michael from Umhlanga, welcome. Sam all the way from Joburg, hi. And then I see the questions is just like rolling in, Prof. So we've got our work cut out for us today. So let me go to the next question. It is from Jack. And they're asking or saying, I think it's a bit of context. I'm a 63-year-old with type 2 diabetes since 2005. My HbA1c then was 7.6. I didn't take it seriously and continued my 4 hours sleep a day of a busy professional career for 10 years. I was an in-house counsel for 2 multinational giant companies in my professional career, and my A1Cs were up and down in the range from 6.1 to 7.3 during this period, up till 2021, January 2021. Until June 2021, I got a serious KP germ infection. 1 month later, I took the first shot of the vaccine, the jab, which probably affected my immune system. The number of my platelets dropped to 25,000, and the doctors finally saved my life, but I lost my right eye vision permanently. My A1C in January before this was 6.8. Now my doctor and nutritionist keeps telling me that I need to eat 500 grams of rice 3 meals a day. After I watch your mind-changing LCHF videos, I changed to 2 meals, lunch and dinner, a day, and eat less than 100 grams of net carbs a day, but a lot of protein and vegetables. In the morning, I only drink coffee with extra virgin olive oil and cheese. In only 2 months, my A1C dropped from 6.1 to 5.6, and my HOMO-IR was 1.79. I'm on 1 pill of metformin and Vildaglin without insulin. I further cut the meds in the evening and only take half a pill in the morning. I feel energetic, and my 2 hour after dinner glucose has not been higher than 140. However, I struggle with the situation that many medical articles in Chinese, I now live in Taipei, that I could find say that LCHF food might cause and lead to ketoacidosis. What is the dangerous for diabetic patients? Have you seen any type 2 diabetes taking LCHF diet ended up having ketoacidosis? And how can I avoid this? Thank you so much, Prof. Best regards.
Fantastic, Jack. Well done. And I'm very happy to answer that question, because the key argument against me in my trial was ketoacidosis. And they produced these 2 so-called experts from top medical schools in South Africa who had not the first clue. They absolutely didn't have the first clue about ketosis and ketoacidosis. So ketoacidosis only occurs in people who are insulin dependent, type 1 diabetics, who do not have any insulin. As a type 2 diabetic, you and me have some insulin, and therefore we cannot develop ketoacidosis. It's essentially impossible, because there's always just enough insulin to pull you back from the brink so that you don't get ketoacidosis. And the difference is that for us, if you really fasted and did lots of running and no carbs, you might get your blood ketone levels up to 3, perhaps 4. Ketoacidosis is more like 10 to 50 units, and that's quite different. So ketoacidosis is a disaster because it shows that the person has no insulin. And the treatment obviously is insulin, but you don't need that. You've proved to yourself, you've reduced your requirements of medication, you're not on insulin, and you've improved your glucose control without insulin. And that's achieved because you're now getting rid of all this carbohydrate, which is causing you all your problems. So no, you cannot get ketoacidosis if you are type 2 diabetic unless you got a complete destruction of all your pancreatic tissue, which simply doesn't happen. Type 2 diabetes, the problem is the insulin doesn't work properly. Ultimately, the tissues become insulin resistant, particularly the liver. And so the liver just pours out glucose all the time. And that's because it's become insulin resistant. And that's what really drives your glucose up and causes you to secrete more insulin. And that just compounds the issue. And then you get metabolic syndrome and all the other components of this disease. So if you want to read about ketoacidosis and how we expose these ignorant people, it's in the book Law of Nutrition or Real Food on Trial. There you can hear the experts trying to tell us that everyone's going to get ketoacidosis on this diet. And it's simply absolutely not true. Just let me remind you that there are millions of people eating this diet and they're not getting ketoacidosis. They're getting what we call nutritional ketosis, which is a normal biological response. Just to remind you, if humans didn't develop ketosis, we would never have survived, because the starvation response is absolutely dependent on ketosis, where you switch glucose metabolism for ketone metabolism. So the brain can survive even though you're not taking in any carbohydrate. And without that, we would all be dead. And it begins at birth. And that's where the irony was. The irony was I was charged with telling a mother to wean her child onto this low-carb, high-fat diet, because that will prevent the child from ever becoming a sugar addict, but more importantly, it'll allow the normal function. So children are born fat because they turn those fat cells into ketone bodies, and the ketones transfer across the blood-brain barrier and develop all the fat you need in the brain. So far from being a killer, ketones in the infant, they're absolutely essential for brain development. And the minute you start eating carbs, you're reducing that effect.
Thank you for that, Prof. I'm going to ask the media team to pop the link to the series of videos that was recorded at the trial, Prof, because you've mentioned it a few times, and we often get this question. And anyone that's interested can go and watch those videos and see when Prof gave the evidence during this trial. The next question, Prof, is from Betsy, and she is asking, is it a good idea to do the 16-8 intermittent fasting with the Banting lifestyle?
Betsy, I believe it is. Excuse me. Yes, I think it is, because that makes you a little bit more ketotic, and I just do believe that periods of ketosis are beneficial to your health in the long term. So yes, no one has ever shown that intermittent fasting is harmful, whereas we know that eating 6 meals a day is very harmful. So the fewer meals you eat, it seems to me, the better it is. And one of the benefits of intermittent fasting is you must be metabolically adapted, fat adapted, and that's the way humans are designed. We're designed to burn fat, and I've just got a lovely little story. This is the story I should have mentioned at the start. So some years ago, an American lady I think she's from California, Camille Heron, came out and ran the Comrades Marathon, which is our 90-kilometer or 56-mile race, and she won the race. And people were a bit surprised because they didn't really know that she was such a great runner. And I think she then went and won another 2 races in the same year. But anyway, when she was interviewed, she said, well, I have to thank Professor Noakes because he wrote Law of Running, and Law of Running inspired me to start running. So that was really exciting. But then she started talking about eating more carbs. And obviously that wasn't what our message is. But on last weekend, she won at the age of 45 now, she's 45. She won a 150-mile race in Greece called the Spartathlon, which is as tough a race as there is in running. And she lowered the record by 2 hours, the women's record by 2 hours, which is massive. And remember, this is a tough event. And then I saw her, she was interviewed after she won the race, and she said she'd changed her approach to the race. She'd reduced her carb intake during the race. And she said she's now only eating 50 grams an hour, which is still too much, but it's not 150 grams or 120 grams. And she said, guess what? She said, I'm a natural fat burner. The people tested me and they said, I'm a natural fat burner, so you don't need much carbs or as many carbs. So that was really exciting, because at this very moment, the team that I work with in Pennsylvania, we're studying what's the lowest amount of carbohydrate you need to maximize performance, not the highest, the lowest. Because what happens in the sciences is that people start to maximize everything because there's a commercial value to that. It's difficult to sell a product if you only need 1 gram of it an hour, but if you need 120 grams of it an hour, then it's rather easier to make a profit. So anyway, she said, I'm a natural fat burner. And the answer is you're a natural fat burner if you don't eat carbs. That's what makes you natural, because we're all natural, but it's hidden. The more carbs you eat, the more you inhibit this natural process of burning fat. So that's, Betsy, what's happening with you with the intermittent fasting is that you revert your body to the way it was designed over millions of years to burn lots of fat. And when I say evolved over millions of years, please understand that many people don't accept evolution, and that's absolutely correct. You know, you have every right to believe that. But then I would say that we were created to burn fat, and that's been taken away from us by the high carb diets. So either way, when you study humans eating a high fat diet, they burn fat. And the way you stop it is by feeding them lots of carbohydrate.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Betsy, for that question. The next question is from Chris. Hi, Prof. Thank you for answering my question a couple of months ago and putting me at ease regarding my lipid subtraction test result. You mentioned that there are up to 200 risk factors for heart disease, but the main one, in your opinion, is diabetes. So are there particular blood tests that you recommend to monitor that risk factor? And what reference ranges would I use as a carnivore? For example, I know that a higher than ideal HbA1c may reflect a longer red blood cell lifespan rather than abnormal glycation.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thank you. So I tweeted this week that the single biggest secret in medicine is that type 2 diabetes is the biggest cause of heart disease, the greatest cause of coronary heart disease. There are other causes of heart disease, but the one that is most prevalent is coronary heart disease. And guess what? It's not gone down. We were told the lipid hypothesis, if we take our statins, our lipids will go down and the disease will disappear. And I worked with it in a different way in sport with a famous cardiologist who worked for industry. And he said, by the year 2000, coronary heart disease will be a thing of the past because the statins are going to work their miracle. Turns out something like $3 trillion has been spent on statins, and the effect on heart disease rates has been essentially zero. So, and now this week, there's a paper that came out where what they did was they looked at a group of people and they measured the various variables like HbA1c. And so they could classify people to pre-diabetes, early diabetes, and type 2 diabetes. And then they scanned their hearts. And what they found was that there was a nice gradient of disease of the coronary arteries, so that with pre-diabetics, there was disease present, but it wasn't as advanced as the next stage of diabetes or people who frankly have type 2 diabetes. There was an absolute relationship, which is really important, because one of the things when we're looking for causation, we want to see a graded effect so that the more of the bad thing you have, the more disease you should have. And they've shown that. And it's so there we have it. And these people were asymptomatic. They did not know that they had anything wrong. So again, I wish we could get this message out that it's type 2 diabetes is what causes arterial disease. What I said in the tweet a few days ago was that the way they hide it, the way the profession hides it, is they say, yes, we know type 2 diabetes is associated, not causal, is associated with heart disease. So therefore, you must take your statins, even more statins, if you have type 2 diabetes. That is the wrong treatment. The treatment is, if you have type 2 diabetes, you're at risk of arterial disease. And what you do is you reverse the type 2 diabetes by not eating carbohydrates and processed foods. That's how you do it. And remember, I came into this whole story because I watched my dad's arteries closing up because he had type 2 diabetes, and no one warned him, including myself, because I didn't understand it, that type 2 diabetes is what kills arteries. And so type 2 diabetes, eventually you get the disease, and 10 years later after diagnosis, you lose your first limb. And 3 years later, you lose your second limb, and a year after that, you die. That's the process. And once you get to that stage, your artery's in such bad shape. Once you lose a limb, your artery's in such bad shape that you're going to have strokes and your kidneys are going to fail. But what these studies show is that that's not necessary. If we get it early enough, we're fine. So Chris, your question was, what variables should you be looking at? Now, I'm of the opinion that what's important is what you eat. That's what's really to focus on. And we're all going to respond slightly differently, and some people will respond better than others. And what worries me is people take these values and say, gosh, I'm eating a low-carb diet, but my HbA1c is still not, it's not 5.0, it's 5.5, and therefore it's not perfect. Perfection is very difficult to get. And I think that the key is do what you need to do and let what happens, happens. I think in my case, I've told this frequently, my dad died 10 years after the diagnosis, and I'm well over 10 years in my diagnosis. And so I've cheated death already. And so if something's to happen, I'll say, well, you know, what would have happened if I hadn't changed my diet? It would have happened much earlier. And I wouldn't have had these fantastic years. So that's my attitude. If you want to measure things, I think a fasting insulin is really important because you want that to be below 4 or 5 units. And most people in every country have values of 10 to 15. And they told that's normal. That's not, that's pre-diabetes. So that's the first thing. Your blood glucose level at rest needs to be as low as possible. And you can look at triglyceride HDLs, and they will all be reasonable. And you mentioned that your HbA1c could be slightly higher than it is because the red cells last longer. Absolutely. So I think the key is to focus on your diet. If you really want to look more closely, I would have a coronary artery calcium score done. So that otherwise they scan your heart and they can tell you how much narrowing you have because of calcium accumulation, i.e. atherosclerosis. And that is the best predictor of the future outcome when you're likely to have a heart attack. The problem is if you have a very high value, you might become neurotic now and worry about it. So that's a problem. But if you go and have a calcium score of 0, you know that you are almost, and you stay on a low-carb diet for the rest of your life, you can almost guarantee yourself you're not going to have arterial disease ever. And that's, I would just say, well, fantastic. A calcium artery score of 0 is just like, that's amazing. You can't have anything better than that. The HbA1c can't tell you that. The HDL cholesterol triglyceride ratio can't tell you that. So that's the ultimate test. So if you are really concerned and you think that maybe my values aren't as perfect as they could be, have the calcium CAC score done. And if it's low, then you're at almost 0 risk of ever having a heart attack. The other thing that to keep your calcium score low might be to increase vitamin D3 and K2 intakes, because there's some interest in those as being protective against coronary arterial disease.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you so much for that interesting question. The next question is from Michael. Hey, Prof. I hope you are well, and thanks for putting aside time for us again. I'm sure you have seen athletes, even carnivores or keto athletes, say that sugar after a workout is needed. Some take a tablespoon of honey after a workout. Recently, I read that after a workout, the liver releases glucose into the bloodstream. 2 questions arise. Do we need a shot of external glucose after a workout, or is what the liver releases enough?
No, you definitely don't need any intake of glucose, because that tablespoon of sugar actually is trivial. Well, it's trivial total amount because it's only 5 grams, but it's not in terms of the blood glucose, because the blood has only got 5 grams in it. So the body has to get rid of that 5 grams. But the interesting thing is when you exercise, you turn off your own glucose metabolism. And your insulin, it's astonishing. You know, you can start exercise with insulin of 30. Remember we said the best value is about 5 or 6. You can start, if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet and it's been repeatedly tested, You can start with a value of 20 or 30, which is way up. Within 30 minutes, it'll be down to very, very low values. And the same with blood glucose levels. So the body is incredibly good at regulating the blood glucose concentration the moment you start exercising. And that's probably one of the good reasons, one of the good benefits of exercise. If you take abnormal glucose, blood glucose levels, abnormal insulins, and you get someone to exercise, they normalize very, very quickly. And they will stay in that condition as long as you're exercising. So the small amount of glucose will have an effect, but it's just pretty trivial. And the other thing is your body's probably burning quite a lot of carbohydrates, so it will simply use that carbohydrate as a fuel instead of fat. But it's not necessary. The reason they take it is because they've got a sugar addiction. That's it. It's like a sugar addiction shot that they need to take after exercise. And the problem with that is that it can lead to progressively increasing addiction. So what we've learned in the last few years is that sugar addiction is the hidden addiction that prevents people losing weight on the start. And many people won't adopt the low-carb diet because they say, I can't stop eating sugar or I can't stop drinking wine. Those are the two explanations I get. No, I can't follow your diet because I'm not going to stop wine. Why aren't you going to stop wine? Well, actually, I've got an addiction to wine, but they don't say that. So the answer is, if you're an athlete and you're eating a low carb diet, a teaspoon of sugar after a workout is immaterial. It's not going to do anything. But if it becomes 2 or 3 or 4 and it's repeated and you go back onto the sugar binge, then it's a problem. But in the short term, it's neither here nor there. It really means nothing.
Thank you so much, Prof, and thank you for that interesting question. The next question is from Glauce. Prof, I've been converted to the diet, but my husband hasn't. How can I convince him to stop eating bread and biscuits? Recently, he had a blood test done. Could I ask you to read his results? His triglycerides were 175 milligrams per deciliter. I converted like you did for me, and if I did it right, his is 1.97, and his HDL is 62 milligrams per deciliter, glucose 106, and the insulin is 4.2.
Okay, so, we didn't hear how old Glauce's husband is.
No, we don't know.
Okay, so eating biscuits and what else is just part of the addiction. And that's the problem, to give up the addiction. And the only reason people will give up the addiction is if they feel there's a benefit, so that they see their health failing. And the values, his triglycerides are way too high and the HDL is way too low, and that will be reversed with a high-fat diet. His insulin is very good, and the fasting glucose is just above, it's at the upper limit of normal. The only thing I could suggest is having a proper glucose tolerance test and see what happens. And because when you do a proper glucose tolerance test and you measure insulin, you pick up at least 30-40% more cases of pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes than conventional testing with a glucose tolerance test. But it's pointless if the guy's not motivated. We all required to be in a state to change. We have to be ready to change. And so somehow you have to move your husband to the state where he will start to think it's important to change. And that's very complex. You need to read up about that. How do you get him into the position where he will change? One way is to see what his family history is like. If he has a family member who's had type 2 diabetes and died as a result, and then show your husband that's the way he's going to die, or he could die if he becomes frankly diabetic. The other thing is, does he have any symptoms? Is he lethargic? Does he fall asleep when he's watching the movies? All those things that could indicate he needs to change his diet, and his glucose control is not as good. The other one would be to ask him to wear a continuous glucose monitor. and then show him what his glucose is doing after he's eaten those biscuits. And maybe just ask him, so tell me, dear husband, what do you think is your blood glucose when you had those biscuits and the other carbs or the apple? And then you'll show that it goes way above 106. And that might just frighten him and say, well, this is happening every time you eat these biscuits, and your system is going to fail ultimately.
For that, Prof. The next question is from Meg. Prof, what is the difference between insulin resistance and being pre-diabetic?
That's a great question. Thank you, Meg, for that. So insulin resistance is a state in which the body requires more insulin to regulate the blood glucose than normal. So let's go back to basics. The basics are that humans are designed to burn fat, and we do that very well, and we don't need masses of insulin to do that. What happened 18,000 years ago was we changed our diets to increase the carbohydrate content of the diet. And for millions of years, we hadn't been adapted that way. And so now all of a sudden we had this challenge, and the body decided, or somebody decided, that the body's response would be to regulate the glucose. And that became the primary focus of metabolism, which is remarkable. So the primary driver in human metabolism is to regulate the blood glucose level to prevent it going high. Now, I didn't know that until a year ago, and there it was described as the first rule. The first rule of metabolism is that your whole body is trying to regulate the blood glucose control. Now, what seems to happen is that if you eat a high carbohydrate diet for enough years, your ability to regulate your glucose gets worse, and you develop insulin resistance. And with time, the insulin resistance raises your blood glucose all day, and that would be the state of prediabetes. We would find that your glucose was above the normal range and your insulin was above the normal range. Now, what happens in medicine is that we couldn't diagnose diabetes by measuring insulin because insulin only became available for measurement in the 1970s. So the first test was when glucose appears in your urine. Now, it turns out that that's frank diabetes, because now your blood glucose is so high that it's pouring out of the kidneys into your urine. And so the first way you diagnosed diabetes was you found glucose in the urine. And that's terminal. I mean, you've already got very, very advanced diabetes. Now, because we can measure glucose and insulin, and we can measure glucose so easily, we can measure your glucose all day and show the patterns. And then we decide that this is not normal, this is prediabetes. And for example, we did a study, which we published a few months ago, where we looked at 10 runners on a high-fat diet and a high-carbohydrate diet. And we monitored their blood glucose levels for 24 hours a day for about 4 weeks. So we got a complete picture of what their glucose was doing on the high-carb diet and the high-fat diet. And these are healthy athletes training 80 kilometers a week, able to run 5Ks in 20 minutes. So they're better than 80% of all runners in the United States. And 3 of them were pre-diabetic, had no clue. Now, we can only diagnose that because we've got the technology now to measure it. So what's happening is, from measuring urine and making a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, we can now measure the presence of pre-diabetes at a much younger age. And I can promise you, if we went out and looked at 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds who've got visceral obesity, and many of your kids already have visceral obesity, we would find that they're pre-diabetic. Because if we use the proper testing. So we would say you're pre-diabetic, you've got insulin resistance, and now you've got to stop taking carbs, because insulin resistance itself is not a problem. I'm profoundly insulin resistant. all that means is you cannot eat carbs. You're intolerant of carbs because you can't store the carbohydrate. You can't get it out of the bloodstream. And so you hypersecrete insulin, and then insulin acts inappropriately throughout the body. So that's what insulin resistance is. But you can be insulin resistant, but not sick if you don't eat carbs. It's the carbs that are the problem in this condition.
Thank you, Prof, for explaining it so clearly to all of us. The next question is from Sam. Prof Noakes, what is your suggestions for LMHR, which I'm assuming is a lean mass hyperresponder, with high LDL and low triglycerides and low BMI?
Well, I would just congratulate you and say you're going to live a long and happy life. Cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease. It's diabetes that's the cause of heart disease, and that's what we have to get the message out. And there's a whole lots of interest on Twitter at the moment, and there are a lot of studies showing that the worst thing to have is the worst thing to have is diabetes. The second worst thing is to have a low LDL cholesterol. And they never report that. But in all the studies where they were looking at cholesterol causing heart disease, there's always a U-shaped curve. And so it turns out that the people with the lowest cholesterol in these studies were at the same risk as those with the highest cholesterols. But when we talk about risk, the risk was trivial. It was unbelievably trivial, but it was magnified because these people were trying to terrify everyone that having a high cholesterol is bad for you. But in fact, the people with high cholesterol, the probability that they were going to die was minuscule. So that wasn't the factor. It was the diabetes that's always a factor. So I wouldn't worry. I must admit, I spoke to a good friend of mine in Australia yesterday morning, and he was telling me that in his clinic, he looks at people with this condition. And he found that often vitamin B12 can be deficient, and that B12 may help in reducing your cholesterol. So that's just a suggestion that there may be other explanations for the high cholesterol in people with this condition. But honestly, there's no evidence that it's harmful, and there has to be, because all your markers are so good. Our traditional explanation would be that you're incredibly healthy. And as long as you stay that way and don't start smoking or develop type 2 diabetes, you're going to live a long and happy and healthy life.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Sam. The next question is actually also about lean mass hyperresponder, and it's from Wendy. And she's saying, I've been carnivore, meat, fish, eggs, no dairy for a year now, coming from ketovore. My blood shows I might be a lean mass hyperresponder. It has been suggested that I have a small bowl, that I have a small bowl of berries with some honey once a day. What are your thoughts?
Well, Wendy, it's entirely up to you. I think that, because you're under control, you're eating the diet, that amount of carbohydrate is going to be trivial. It might be 30 grams of carbohydrates. And if you're generally not eating any other carbohydrate, that's fine. And there may be some value in berries. There may be some so-called antioxidants or whatever. But so if you want to eat it, try it and see what happens. And, monitor your own response. That's the beauty of people who work with their diets. They're self-experimenters. And remember, we're all different. And so for me, those berries might be enough to push my glucose too high, and that might not be acceptable to me. But in your case, it may well be that you're not insulin resistant, or you're not as insulin resistant as I am, and you're not so carbohydrate intolerant. And then, honestly, those berries are not going to make a difference. There's so little carbohydrate in them. The same with honey. Again, it's the only problem I always have is the addiction side of it. That's what would always worry me. And it might be that all of a sudden you find you're taking 2 teaspoons of honey or you're eating the berries more frequently. but I know that you're disciplined and you wouldn't do that. But for many people, you have to remember that the sugar addiction is driven by the brain, and you have to reprogram the brain. It's not a matter of saying, oh, I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to be disciplined. Yes, that starts, but you have to completely rewire the brain so that it doesn't search for these addictive foods. That's the description of an addict, is someone who's always searching for the addictive substance, whether it's cocaine or whatever. And so that's the key. You're welcome to include that once a day in your diet, and just monitor yourself and see how you respond. And I would guess that it's not going to make any difference. It may well make you feel a little bit better.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. The next question is from Arthur. I am primarily carnivore except for coffee. What's your thoughts about the toxins in coffee?
It's interesting that when you look up coffee and its health hazards, there are none. I've never seen it described where coffee's been linked with anything. Now, that's very surprising, because you have to understand that to prove cause and effect, you have to take 40,000 people, divide them, one group 20,000, the other group 20,000. You have to put them in a concentration camp, and so that they'd live exactly the same lives, except there's one thing you change, and that's, say, coffee. So you can't do that. So what happened in the 1980s, 1990s, the scientists said, we can't do that. So what's the next best thing we can do? What we'll do, we'll take a population, and in America, they took the nurses and doctors in Harvard, and they followed them for 40 years. And they would do a food analysis of what they were eating, let's say every 10 years or so, and they'd ask them, so what did you eat yesterday? And that's impossible, because no one remembers what they eat. And these food questionnaires are a complete disaster. But anyway, they developed this whole science of nutrition is based on those hypotheses. Now, what happens is then after 40 years, they've got so much data that they can find anything. So they wake up in the morning and say, well, let's look at lung cancer. These people got lung cancer, what were they eating differently from everyone else? The next day, it's malignant melanoma. The next day, it's diabetes. And so Walter Willett, who drives this research, is one of the most cited scientists in the world. But this is not science, because it's not an experiment. It's just an observational study. And the problem is that people who do certain things don't do other things. And in my opinion, they focused for a long time on grains and so-called healthy grains. And the problem was that the people that they started studying were in the 1970s. And those people were being told, you mustn't smoke, you must do lots of exercise, you must run marathons, and you must eat grains. So all of those, any of those four factors could explain why they're healthy, but they chose only the grains. And they don't know how to adjust for the other variables. And they routinely come up with this observation that people who eat grains are healthier. But yet when we look at diabetes rates globally, it's very clear that a high carbohydrate diet is not beneficial. So there's something wrong with their analyses and these other analyses. So that's the problem. But my point is that they've looked at coffee, and no one has ever been able to show coffee is dangerous. And that may be a healthy marker. In other words, healthy people drink coffee. And coffee, maybe it's expensive. So people who are wealthier, who are always going to be healthier, are drinking coffee. So, but the point is, there's never been one iota of suggestion that coffee might be bad for you. In contrast, there's plenty of suggestive evidence that meat's wrong for you, etc., and saturated fat. But when they do the proper studies and they get away from this sort of epidemiological associational type research, then they find there's nothing. Meat's never been shown to be linked to anything. And so coffee, as far as I can see, there's no reason to be concerned. And in fact, there may well be health benefits in the long term.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you for that interesting question. The next question, also I say questions, is from Michael. I see you sent quite a few questions. I'm going to ask you two of them. He says it's a tough one because you would not know my medical history, but I just want to know if you have seen this before and perhaps know the reason. I was on a strict keto diet, lots of chicken, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, and spinach. I cured my GERD and IBS and lost 25 kilograms in 3 months. Got very strong. As I was working out as a professional trainer, I got very fit and was running trail races every weekend. Always in the top 20 finishes. Yet I developed terrible brain fog and worse, strange weakness in my legs. So much so that I would almost fall when one leg would give way while I was walking. It got so bad, I was eventually tested for MS, and subsequently I went back on a higher carb diet and it went away. But when I put a lot of weight back, then I put a lot of weight back on. So I'm carnivore now and it's much better. Gaining lean mass, not as skinny as when I was on keto and no leg weakness, but better, but getting bigger and losing fat at the same time. What do you think was the issue with the high amounts? What do you think was the issue? Was it with the high amounts of veg I was eating? Question mark. And then there's another question,
Yeah.
but maybe you can just answer this.
Yeah, I would think so. Again, I emphasize always people are individuals. But I'm glad you solved the problem because I wouldn't have known what to suggest. But when you remove something from your diet and then you get better, it's very likely that it was those factors. I would, again, how could eating vegetables cause those symptoms? I mean, those are serious, serious symptoms. And how could they explain it? I don't know. I've just, on Twitter a few days ago, there was a person who had the most severe skin eruptions I've ever seen in my life. They were catastrophic. And he was taking all sorts of medications, I mean, buckets of medication and injections. Changed to carnivore, gone. In a few months, gone. Now, no one yet knows what happened. But it does show you that there are some people who are so allergic to something in vegetables that they produce all these symptoms. And I can only think that the same must have happened to you, that you had a brain response. The brain just wasn't happy. There was an inflammation, I would guess. You had an inflammation in your brain and your spinal cord, and that would explain those weaknesses that you had. And that was caused by something in the vegetables or your response to those vegetables. And you cured it by cutting them. So that's fantastic. And that what's so exciting is that you did it yourself, because if you'd gone to conventional medicine, you would never have been told to eat a carnivore diet. But yet again, as I emphasize, that's the diet that maybe we were created to eat.
Thank you, Prof. The second part of his question is, what is more casual in developing insulin resistance and the associated metabolic syndrome? The vegetable seed oils or carbs? I've read that fats are the cause, and I have studied that carbs are the cause. Does one exacerbate the other, and is it the combination of the two, or can they both use different mechanisms? Cause insulin resistant if used excessively in isolation. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for making that observation. If you look at the growth of chronic disease in the United States, it's unquestionably the seed oils track it the best. So by association, you'd say that seed oils were worse. As far as diabetes goes, the introduction of sugar into communities like in South Africa, where we have rural Africans who moved to the cities, and this was studies done in the 1960s by G.D. Campbell. And what he noticed was that 20 years after rural Africans moved into the cities, they'd start to develop type 2 diabetes. And he looked at the factors. And that was prior to the increase in seed oils. And he found, and he was convinced that it was the sugar. And so there is a whole story about saccharine disease, that once the sugar gets into these populations that have always eaten their traditional foods, that's when the diseases start. The trouble is the sugar comes and the vegetable oils then come subsequently. It's really interesting. One of our Nutrition Network people that we're training at the moment, she's a medical trained person. She worked in the Cook Islands, and she said diabetes is rampant. And I said, what did they used to eat? And of course, the Cook Islanders used to eat coconuts and fish. That's what they ate. And the moment the processed food diet arrived, then the diabetes just goes chaotic. And so it happens across the globe, but the countries where you see it now is in the Pacific Islanders, because that's happened in the last 50 years. The introduction of sugar obviously happened over the last 200 years or so. So that happened a long time ago. And the wheat happened before that. So it's more difficult to decide exactly what it is. But I would be happy to say that seed oils are a problem. The trouble is we just don't have the mechanism, whereas with sugar, we do have a mechanism. It's just repeated glucose insulin spiking that then, in my opinion, ultimately causes a failure of other systems, then you become insulin resistant. It's entirely possible that the seed oils contribute hugely to that, and that they affect the membranes of the body, and those membranes then become more insulin resistant. Whereas if you're eating saturated fat, the saturated fat makes the membranes, and so it's completely different structures. So I would teach both, that both are toxic. But it's easier perhaps to address the sugar than the seed oils, because it's difficult to get all seed oils out of the diet, and it's difficult to get the healthy saturated fats and polyunsaturated fats into the diet. That's it, or certainly the polyunsaturated fats, which come mainly in fish oils. That's more difficult to get them into the diet.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. It's very interesting. We have come to the end of the live, but I think I'm going to squeeze in one last question, Prof. And
Good.
the question is from Roderick, and they're asking, when will the new edition of The Law of Running come out?
Thank you, Roderick, for asking that question, because it's a question that the publishers are also quite interested in. So I hope they're watching, but I don't know if they might be. So what's happened was that I had to be absolutely certain that I understood carbohydrate metabolism so that I don't make another mistake with the new edition. So I made this horrid error with the 1986 was the first one. It's right up till 2002, I made this horrible error on promoting carbs as the solution for all exercise performance. Now, what we've done essentially is to disprove that completely. And we've made two findings which are completely seminal and really throw out this whole carbohydrate story. But when I write the book, the new book, I've got to make sure I get it absolutely right, but also in a palatable way for the readers. Because if I go and say, oh, you must avoid the carbs and it's all wrong and blah, 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 people are not going to, they don't accept that easily. I understand that. So they've got to be introduced to it slowly, carefully. And so what I've been doing over the last year and a half is to go through all the studies of carbs and exercise, every last one. And I've probably looked and tabulated something like 500 articles. And from that, I've learned a lot. And I think I can now explain the whole story in a way that's understandable and manageable, and that I can shift people along the curve to say, well, I used to eat carbs, but actually maybe I should start reducing carbs. And then ultimately we'll get to prove to them that they actually don't need the carbs. So Roderick, the answer is I have almost finished the major paper showing why carbohydrates are not necessary during exercise and why they may be harmful, or why we made all these errors. And as I finish that, when I've done that, then we go full term onto the book. And I'm really excited because it's going to be done quicker if I get people to help me. And my great friend Karim Khan, who was the editor of the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and who's an absolute genius in sports medicine. He's the expert. He's written the textbook called Clinical Sports Medicine with another friend of mine, Peter Bruckner, and they have written this incredible textbook. It is just magnificent. It's once in a lifetime, a textbook comes along, that is the textbook, and that's the one. And, you know, he sort of dropped a hint. He said, Karim said to me, so tell me, how are you going to handle the sports medicine in your law of running rewrite? And he said, because, you know, there's this textbook. You can't, he didn't say this, it's interpretation. You can't compete with this textbook. So you're only going to be repeating what's in this textbook. So then I woke up one night and said, he must write the chapters on sports medicine. So then that saves me going, updating my own knowledge in sports medicine, because I've got the best person in the world to do it. And he's just a genius when it comes to that. And that's the first bit. And then I'm looking for people to help to update the training science, because I've been out of the training science since the 1990s to early 2000s. And Paul Larson, he's agreed to help. Now, Paul is very strong on low carbs and he's very strong on training. And so he will help me make sure that we don't make huge errors in training. Because if you read Law of Running, the originals, it was more focused on marathon and ultramarathon running. It wasn't focused on middle distance running or other sports. And so Paul will bring in that expertise. So the book is well on the way, but I estimate it'll take another 2 years before we finish the final. Then it'll take another 6 months in the editing process. So I was hoping because the first edition was 1985, so I was hoping for the 40th edition in 2025. We might just get it in for Christmas 2025. But I think you understand that this is the last time I'm ever going to rewrite it. This will be my legacy. So I've got to get it right. And I want this book to last 100 years, so that in 100 years' time, people will say, you know, that was the book. That was the book, and it's not wrong on what it says. There's a lot of new stuff, but everything in that book is solid.
Thank you so much, Prof. and Roderick. There you have your answer. Now we all know. Yeah, I mean, I'm now excited. I can't wait for the book. Thank you for all the hard work and effort that goes into that, and just everything else you do, Prof. Thank you for taking the time today to answer all the questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. It was so lovely having you here. So many interesting questions. I have to apologize. I know we didn't get to all of them. So please make sure to tune into our next Facebook Live next month, end of November. Can you believe it? We're almost at the end of the year. So that would mean that will also be our last Facebook Live with Prof. Noakes for the year of 2023. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Prof. Have a lovely day further.
Thanks, Jana. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your beautiful questions. They were fantastic. I really enjoyed all of them. And looking forward to seeing you. You know what I think, Jana? I think we should make it a 2-hour next for the end of the year.
That's a good suggestion. That's a good suggestion, Prof.
We can get through all the questions or more questions.
Definitely. Let's do that. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.